Welcome to the debate.
Glad to be here.
So I want you to imagine a workplace where a 250-pound man is legally allowed to just slam his forearm into your ribs every single time you take a step.
Right. Yeah. Sounds awful.
It does, right? But that was the NBA in 1993. Now imagine a completely different workplace where if you lose focus for like 0.3 of a second, you are instantly exposed, benched, and millions of people globally are just mocking you online.
A completely different kind of nightmare.
Exactly. And that is the NBA today. So on this show, we are looking past the simplistic barbershop arguments to answer a much deeper question.
Yeah. The classic question. Which era of professional basketball was fundamentally harder to play in? The 1990s or the modern game?
Right. And we really want to frame this not as just, comparing highlight reels. This is a structural exploration of how basketball's evolution, sports science, rule changes, the culture itself, how all of that dictates entirely different demands on the human body and mind.
Because comparing the two isn't just asking which is harder. It's asking, which specific skills were being pushed to their absolute limits.
Exactly. So I will just lay my cards on the table right away. The 1990s NBA was definitively harder. It was this crucible of structural violence, a pure survival of the fittest environment defined by brutal physicality and, frankly, an uncompromising physical endurance test.
Well, I hear you, but I think you are confusing blunt trauma with athletic difficulty.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I am. I'd argue the modern NBA is significantly harder. The challenge didn't just magically disappear because we outlawed clotheslines, right? It just shifted. The difficulty moved from absorbing physical impact to surviving this aerobic and cognitive red line.
A cognitive red line. Okay.
Yeah. Today's players, they have to be technically, tactically, and physically flawless. They are processing lightning-fast analytical variables against a massively expanded global talent pool, where the margin for error is honestly essentially zero.
Okay, well, to understand why the 90s were the ultimate gauntlet, I think we really have to break down the actual mechanics of that era's defensive culture.
Let's do it.
Because I know anyone who grew up watching like the Bad Boy Pistons or the New York Knicks is probably screaming at their phone right now. They're worried we are minimizing the blood and the bruises.
Oh, the bruises were very real.
They were, but we aren't just talking about hard fouls. We are talking about the actual biomechanics of the hand-checking rule.
Right, the famous hand check.
Yeah. That rule allowed defenders to legally plant their forearm squarely onto an offensive player's hip, and by doing that, a defender completely controls your center of gravity.
They steer you.
Exactly, they steer you. They literally prevent you from exploding off your back foot, so you aren't just playing basketball anymore. You are engaging in this continuous, exhausting, isometric wrestling match just to get to your spot on the floor.
I mean, it was basically rugby on hardwood at times.
It really was. Look at the historical evidence of Michael Jordan facing those Detroit Pistons. The Jordan rules weren't just some clever defensive rotation. They were a coordinated physical war designed to inflict pain.
Well, they definitely wanted to put him on the floor.
Constantly. The caloric expenditure required just to establish position in the post, it fundamentally degrades your legs before you even attempt a shot. Jordan being knocked down again and again and still performing proves how unforgiving it was. Modern players, they simply do not have to navigate that kind of structural violence.
I won't deny the physical trauma of the 90s. The tape is right there. But we have to separate pain from athletic difficulty.
How so?
Pain makes it difficult.
It does, but by removing that specific type of contact, the NBA didn't eliminate the physical toll. They just changed the currency of the toll, right? From blunt force to cardiovascular exhaustion.
Okay, explain that. Well, the spatial geometry of the court has absolutely exploded. In the 90s, the game was played inside a phone booth. The paint was just totally clogged. And you had guys standing still on the perimeter.
Because they were allowed to hand check, so you couldn't move freely.
Sure, but today, players have to cover the entire 94 by 50-foot floor constantly. Look at Stephen Curry.
Oh, the stamina is incredible. I'll give you that.
Right? His constant, relentless off-ball movement, it completely exhausts defenses. Defending in the modern NBA means you are sprinting through multiple screens, changing direction instantly, and recovering out to the three-point line, possession after possession.
Yeah, but
Just let me finish this thought. The sheer pace of the modern game requires a baseline of fast-twitch muscle endurance that simply was not demanded when, four guys stood around watching one guy isolate in the post.
See, you're equating cardiovascular tracking data with actual athletic resistance.
I don't think those are mutually exclusive.
But they are different. Look, running a marathon requires incredible endurance, right? We all know that.
Sure.
But running a marathon while people are actively trying to tackle you is a fundamentally harder sport.
Okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration, tackle you.
But it's not. The density of physical engagement is what made the 90s so uniquely punishing. How can continuous movement in open space, no matter how fast it is, equate to the sheer physiological degradation caused by taking an elbow to the ribs every single time you drive to the basket?
Because the type of endurance is different.
In the 90s, if you were a guard attacking the rim, you knew a 260-pound center was waiting there and he was legally permitted to knock you out of the air. That creates a baseline of physical fear and literal muscle breakdown that running around a high screen just doesn't replicate.
You're focusing entirely on physical endurance, though, like the ability to take a hit.
Which is incredibly hard.
It is, but I am talking about physical capacity, the ability to operate an engine at its absolute maximum without a single second to rest.
But they did rest in the 90s.
Yes. Let's look at the mechanics of defending a modern five-out offense. In a five-out system, all five offensive players stand outside the three-point line. The paint is entirely empty.
Right. Spacing.
Right. So a defender can no longer hide near the basket and catch their breath, which, let's be honest, happened constantly in the 90s. Big men were basically camping in the lane.
They were holding their ground.
They were resting. Today, if you take one single step in the wrong direction to help on a drive, the ball is whipped to the corner and you surrender 3 points. You are comparing trench warfare, which is, slow and brutal.
Exactly, brutal.
To air traffic control, where you are tracking multiple high-speed variables simultaneously across a massive radar screen.
In 90s isolation basketball, you could rest on defense if your man didn't have the ball. Today, if you rest for a half second, you lose.
But you're divorcing the physical tax from the cognitive one. You act as if 90s players weren't processing complex variables just because the floor was smaller.
I'm saying the variables were fewer. I disagree. The idea that 90s basketball was tactically simple is just a massive misconception. Take Phil Jackson's triangle offense with the Bulls.
Okay, the triangle is a good example.
It was a highly sophisticated read and react system. It required incredible spatial awareness and timing. It was this fluid geometry that relied entirely on the player's basketball IQ to read the defense's micro adjustments in real time.
The triangle is a perfect example, actually, because it highlights the difference in scale.
How so?
Well, the triangle was a brilliant system, yes, but it was largely utilized by one dominant franchise, operating at a very deliberate, slow pace. Today, the tactical complexity of the game is universal, and it's driven by analytics.
Right, the spreadsheets.
It's not just a spreadsheet, though. Let's ground what analytics actually means here. It's expected value.
Which tells them all to shoot threes.
Because of the math, the mathematical realization that a 33% three-point shooter is mathematically more valuable than a 45% mid-range shooter. That fundamentally outlawed the mid-range game.
And made the game look like a three-point contest.
But it forced defenses to cover exponentially more square footage. Positional basketball is completely dead. Today, a 7-foot center must be able to shoot three-pointers, put the ball on the floor, and make reads as a playmaker.
I'll concede the big men are more skilled on the perimeter now.
Right, and that creates relentless, split-second decision-making pressure. You are processing drive and kick mechanics, secondary drives, defensive rotations, all within tenths of a second.
Look, I understand the speed of modern processing, but here is the critical difference. Executing complex sets, like the triangle, while under the intense physical duress we just talked about, that requires a sharper, more resilient basketball IQ.
More resilient than modern players?
Yes, because it is one thing to make a mathematical read when the floor is completely open and contact is illegal.
Contact isn't illegal, it's just regulated.
Barely. It is an entirely different mental challenge to read a defense, thread a bounce pass, or execute a backdoor cut when an enforcer is legally hand-checking you, when they are disrupting your balance and actively trying to physically intimidate you.
I see what you're saying, but
The psychological resilience required to execute tactics while under the threat of physical harm, that makes the 90s mental game far more demanding. You are fighting through an opponent's physical will, not just solving a geometric puzzle.
But that geometric puzzle is exactly what causes the cognitive collapse, though.
A cognitive collapse?
Yes! The irony of the modern game is that creating that uncontested three you mentioned, it requires a labyrinth of flawless tactical execution to generate.
Sure, the passing is crisp.
It's more than crisp. When an engine runs at the red line, it deprives the brain of oxygen right when modern offensive schemes require a player to process those 5 different pick-and-roll variables.
Which again is just capacity, not durability.
Well, we have to zoom out from the X's and O's on the court then. If we are talking about the total difficulty of the era, we really have to look at the broader ecosystem surrounding the players.
The talent pool, you mean?
Exactly. In the 90s, the talent pool was heavily restricted, primarily domestic. Today, the NBA is a truly global league, and that fundamentally changes the difficulty of simply surviving on a roster.
See, if we look at the ecosystem, the 90s still proved to be the ultimate gauntlet.
How? The pool was smaller.
Because the centralization of that talent pool is exactly what made the rivalries so incredibly bitter and the path to a championship so brutal.
I'm not sure I follow.
Think about it. The prolonged dominance of teams like the Chicago Bulls proves how incredibly difficult it was to reach the summit. You had an established hierarchy.
Right, the gatekeepers.
Yes, you had gatekeepers like the Pistons or the Celtics before them, and you had to literally bleed to take their spot. The concentration of sheer competitive willpower in a single playoff series in the 90s was unmatched because you were playing the exact same giants year after year in a closed system.
I have to disagree there. A dominant dynasty spanning an entire decade actually indicates the exact opposite.
Really? It means it was easy?
Not easy, but it shows that staying at the top was more controllable once you finally breached the gates. The gap between the best team and the worst team in the 90s was a chasm.
There were expansion teams, sure.
Exactly. But today, because of the massive influx of transcendent talent from Europe, Africa, and beyond, that gap has evaporated. We have 7-footers from overseas who grew up playing point guard.
The skill level is high, yes.
It's historically high. This drastically widened talent pool means the sheer baseline of technical skill in the league has skyrocketed. The variance between the best player on a roster and the 15th man on the bench is razor thin compared to the 90s.
I mean, the role players are better shooters now. I'll give you that.
Almost every single team in the modern NBA has star-level, hyper-efficient players. So yes, the Bulls had to overcome the Pistons, but once they did, the infrastructure allowed them to stay there.
They still had to execute.
They did. But today, because of that immense global parity, it is fundamentally harder to win every night. You cannot take a Tuesday night off against the worst team in the league because their roster is filled with elite global shooters who will absolutely run you off the floor if you drop your focus for a minute.
Okay, I acknowledge the global talent pool is wider, and I agree the baseline skill level of the average rotation player is higher.
Thank you.
But the apex of the 90s required a specific type of mental fortitude that modern players are entirely insulated from.
Insulated how?
Through the modern infrastructure. Heavily influenced by sports science, the modern league actively coddles the athlete.
Oh, come on, coddles?
It does. Today we have load management. Players sit out nationally televised games strictly because a biometric wearable device dictates their injury risk is slightly elevated.
That's just smart medicine.
Maybe. But in the 90s, your recovery protocol was a stake, an ice pack, and immense internal willpower.
And shortened careers.
But they played. You played 82 games through sprained ankles, bone bruises, and immense fatigue because the culture simply demanded it. The difficulty wasn't just defeating the opponent, it was defeating your own failing body.
See, coddling is the wrong word entirely. Sports science hasn't made the game easier. It has raised the absolute threshold of what the human body is expected to do.
By letting them rest?
No, by allowing them to perform at these extreme levels. Teams use hyperbaric chambers and biometric tracking because the physical demands of covering 94 feet at sprint speeds for 48 minutes, it's physiologically unsustainable without them.
They ran in the 90s too.
Not like this. If a 90s player attempted to navigate a modern defensive rotation for a full season without load management, their tendons would literally snap.
I think you're underestimating 90s toughness.
And I think you're underestimating modern biomechanics. But let's add the psychological layer to this ecosystem, because we're talking about mental fortitude, right?
Right. The pressure.
90s media pressure was high, obviously. Michael Jordan was on the cover of every newspaper in the world.
The scrutiny was intense.
It was. But it completely lacked the instantaneous, global, omnipresent criticism of modern social media.
Ah, social media.
Yes. Today, a player misses a defensive rotation, and within seconds, literally seconds, they are the target of millions of vicious critiques online.
True.
The psychological burden of constant surveillance, where every single mistake is immediately amplified and memed globally, it creates a baseline anxiety that 90s players just didn't have to navigate.
Look, I will give you the social media point. The mental toll of Twitter and digital surveillance is brutal.
It ruins careers.
It does. But does dealing with online trolls actually make it harder to put a basketball through a hoop?
Of course it does. It's psychological weight.
Does brand management make the sport itself harder, or does it simply make the lifestyle of the athlete more annoying?
It's all connected.
Is it? The digital noise stops the second the shot clock starts. What matters when you step onto the hardwood is the man standing in front of you.
Right.
And in the 90s, that man was allowed to physically break you down. I still maintain that the purity of the on-court physical struggle in the 90s, where intimidation was a legitimate tactical weapon, that outweighs the off-court digital noise of today.
But the noise doesn't stop when the shot clock starts, though. That's the thing.
You think they're checking their phones on the bench?
No, but that pressure fundamentally infiltrates the court and dictates how the game is played. When players know that a single bad shooting night affects their global brand, their marketability, and frankly, their mental health because of targeted digital harassment, that affects split-second on-court decision-making.
You really think they hesitate because of Twitter?
Absolutely. The hesitation to take a clutch shot because of the fear of going viral for a miss is a real, measurable psychological phenomenon in today's game. You are asking a modern player to operate at peak physical capacity, process complex analytics in real time, and simultaneously carry the psychological weight of a globalized, instantaneous feedback loop.
It is a lot of pressure, I'll admit.
It's a pressure cooker, one that 90s players who could retreat to their private lives after a bad game never truly experienced.
Well, it seems we are looking at two completely different frameworks for evaluating difficulty here.
Yeah, different biological filters for survival.
Exactly. If I were to summarize the 90s based on the mechanics we've discussed today, it was the ultimate physical endurance test. It was a literal crucible.
A test of blunt force, yeah.
You had to withstand immense physical punishment. You had to navigate rules that inherently favored the defense's ability to grab and steer you, and you had to maintain your composure while being battered. If you shied away from contact, if you couldn't take a hit from a 260-pound enforcer, you're systematically filtered out of the league. It was a game of pure attrition.
Right. And on the other side, the modern game is a gauntlet of hyper-efficiency and spatial awareness.
The air traffic control.
Exactly. It requires a player to be technically, athletically, and tactically flawless. You cannot hide a one-dimensional player on the court anymore. If you are a great defender but can't shoot, the analytics will expose you.
You get played off the floor.
Instantly. And if you are a great shooter but can't slide your feet to defend a perimeter sprint, you will be hunted relentlessly by the offense. The modern game demands total versatility, an aerobic capacity that borders on the extreme, an immense mental resilience to process complex geometry and global pressure simultaneously.
You know, what's fascinating is how clearly the source material reveals that the core difficulty of basketball hasn't vanished at all.
Not in the slightest.
It hasn't become an easier sport, nor is it merely a softer version of its past self. It has merely evolved.
Exactly. In the 90s, the filter for survival was blunt force resilience. Today, if you cannot keep up with the overwhelming speed, if you lack the fast-twitch muscle endurance to navigate screens, or if you lack the intellectual complexity to process a 5-out defensive rotation in real time, you fall out of the game just as quickly.
It really is a living organism that constantly shifts its parameters for success.
Beautifully said. The demands just change.
It forces us to redefine what we mean by athletic difficulty entirely.
Both environments are utterly lethal to the unprepared.
Absolutely lethal.
It just depends on whether you find the prospect of absolute physical destruction and isometric wrestling to be more daunting, or the prospect of cognitive overload and aerobic collapse.
Choose your poison, basically.
Exactly. We'll leave you to look closer at your own definitions of athletic difficulty and decide for yourself which era's survival demands you'd rather face.